Alaska isn't for the faint of heart. It's more than just a state, it's a frozen continent that demands respect and blood. In a land ruled by apex predators and relentless cold, only the bravest souls survive. Good evening, friends. Please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. Now, settle into the darkness and listen closely. Here are 4 true horror stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold. They tell you that your 20s are supposed to be the best years of your life, but nobody mentions what happens when you hit 26 and realize you've already spent them. I thought about that a lot during March in the Talkeetna Mountains, watching rich tourists from Anchorage and even Seattle learn to ski on slopes that had become as familiar to me as the cramped studio apartment I rented in Talkeetna proper, the one with the shower that only produced lukewarm water and the landlord who hadn't fixed the heating vent in 2 winters. I moved to Alaska 5 years ago with romantic notions about frontier living and authentic experiences, the kind of delusions that grip college graduates who've read too much Jack London and not enough about actual employment statistics. My degree in kinesiology from Portland State had promised a career in physical therapy or sports medicine, something respectable with a 401k and health insurance that covered dental. Instead, I was teaching trust fund kids how to pizza wedge their skis while earning $16 an hour and living in a town of less than 1,000 people where the most exciting Saturday night involved deciding which of the 3 bars to drink at alone. My parents back in Oregon had stopped asking when I was coming home. They progressed through the stages of parental disappointment, concern, frustration, resignation, and landed on a polite distance that felt like being slowly erased from the family narrative. My younger sister had married a dentist last fall. I'd seen the wedding photos on Facebook, her in white, surrounded by friends I didn't recognize anymore, living a life that existed in a completely different dimension from mine. The thunder started on a Tuesday morning, the first week of March, when we were running advanced slope training for a group of experienced skiers from Fairbanks. I was positioned at the upper bowl of Cathedral Peak, around 8,000 feet, where the snow was still pristine and the wind cut through your gear like it was made of tissue paper. The sky was that specific shade of blue that only exists at altitude, so bright it hurt to look at, and the temperature hovered around 14 degrees, practically balmy for March in the Talkeetnas. That's when I heard it, a sound like the earth cracking open, a deep concussive boom that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Every skier on the slope froze, head snapping toward the sound, because we all knew what it meant. Avalanche. But there was no snow moving. No white wall of death cascading down the mountain. The slopes around us remained perfectly still, pristine and untouched, mocking our terror with their serenity. I checked my radio, called down to base. They'd heard it too, that impossible thunder, but their monitors showed no seismic activity, no snow displacement, nothing. Probably just ice shifting in the glacier, my supervisor radioed back, his voice crackling with static. Keep monitoring, but you're clear to continue. We continued, but the unease lingered like smoke, invisible but choking. The sound had been too loud, too violent, too perfectly timed to be natural ice movement. But what else could it be? The second boom came 3 days later, Friday afternoon, same location, same bone-shaking intensity. This time I was alone, doing a safety sweep after we closed the advanced slopes for the day. The sound rolled across the mountain like artillery fire, and I actually dove behind a boulder, my body reacting before my mind could process, certain that tons of snow were about to bury me alive. Nothing. Perfect stillness. Just me and the wind and the growing certainty that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I started researching that night in my apartment, hunched over my laptop with a bottle of cheap red wine, falling down internet rabbit holes about unexplained mountain sounds. Skyquakes, they called them. Frostquakes. Seismic anomalies. But none of the explanations felt right. None of them accounted for the precision, the consistency, the fact that the sounds only happened on days when we had skiers on the upper slopes. That's when the paranoia started creeping in, the kind that feels less like mental illness and more like your subconscious picking up patterns your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. I started paying attention to which groups were on the mountain when the sounds occurred. Started noticing that certain skiers, always experienced ones, always skiing alone or in small groups, seemed to attract the thunder. On March 12th, a solo skier named David Pritchard didn't come down from the north face. We found his body 2 days later, buried under 15 feet of snow in what looked like a textbook avalanche scenario. Natural causes, the report said. Wrong place, wrong time. His wife from Palmer came to collect his things, her face hollow with grief, and I held her while she cried and felt my own suspicions curl up and die because how could I possibly suggest otherwise? People died in the mountains. It was tragic but inevitable. The fourth boom happened on March 18th, and this time I was close enough to feel the shockwave ripple through the air, close enough to smell something that wasn't snow or ice but something chemical, acrid, wrong. I skied toward the source, my heart hammering, my logical mind screaming at me to turn back. I found the depression in the snow where something had exploded, found fragments of what looked like PVC pipe, found a crater that spoke of controlled detonation rather than natural disaster. That's when I understood. Someone was setting off explosives in the mountains, creating fake avalanches, and David Pritchard hadn't died by accident. I should have gone to the police immediately. Should have called the authorities and let professionals handle it. But I'd spent 5 years in Alaska learning that authority figures in remote areas were often overworked, understaffed, and skeptical of outsiders with wild theories. And I'd spent 26 years learning that nobody took me seriously enough to listen when it mattered. So I started watching. Started paying obsessive attention to patterns, to who was on the mountain when, to the logistics of accessing the blast sites. Started noticing a man who appeared occasionally at base camp, always alone, always carrying a large hiking pack, always disappearing up maintenance trails that most tourists didn't know existed. His name was Robert Chenoweth, and according to the thin file I could find online, he'd worked for a demolition company in Anchorage before moving to Talkeetna 6 years ago. No criminal record. No red flags. Just another middle-aged white man who found his way to Alaska seeking whatever broken people seek at the edge of the world. I followed him on March 23rd, calling in sick to work, tracking him up a service road that led to the eastern slopes. He moved with purpose, his breath foggy in the frozen air, and I stayed far enough back that he wouldn't notice me, close enough that I could see when he stopped and pulled equipment from his pack. Watched him plant what I now knew were improvised explosive devices, crude but effective, positioned to trigger controlled avalanches on specific runs. He was hunting. Using the mountain as his weapon, selecting victims who matched some pattern I couldn't yet see, experienced skiers, always alone, always on routes where their deaths would look natural and inevitable. How many had there been? David Pritchard was the only one I knew about, but these mountains were vast and unforgiving, full of places where bodies could stay buried for years or forever. I was backing away, pulling out my phone to finally call the authorities, when my ski caught on buried brush and I went down hard, the sound of my fall amplified in the crystalline silence. Robert's head snapped around, and our eyes met across 30 yards of snow, and I saw his expression shift from surprise to calculation to something that looked almost like relief. I was wondering when someone would notice, he called out, his voice conversational, almost friendly. 3 years is a long time to work alone. He started walking toward me, and I scrambled to my feet, terror flooding my system with adrenaline. My phone had fallen into deep snow, disappeared, useless. My skis were my only advantage. I was faster than him, younger, knew these slopes intimately. You're wondering why, he continued, still approaching with that horrible casual confidence. They all wonder why. The truth is disappointing. I don't have some tragic backstory or noble motivation. I just like it. The planning, the execution, the way snow erases everything. I pushed off, skiing toward the tree line, my muscles burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard him laugh, heard him radio someone. There was someone else, Jesus Christ, there were two of them, and then the world exploded. The blast was close enough that I felt the heat before the cold, close enough that the shock wave lifted me off my skis and threw me 10 feet through the air. I hit the ground hard, my head cracking against ice, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Snow began to move, that terrible inexorable movement that means you're about to be buried, about to die with powder in your lungs and darkness closing in. But this wasn't a natural avalanche. It was controlled, precise, and it had been aimed just slightly off target, whether by miscalculation or because Robert wanted to play with me first, I didn't know. The snow river passed within feet of where I'd fallen, close enough that I was covered in powder spray, close enough that I could feel the immense weight and power of it, but not close enough to kill. I ran. Abandoned my skis, abandoned my pack, ran through knee-deep snow like a panicked animal, my ears screaming with pain, my balance completely compromised by whatever the blast had done to my inner ear. I fell and got up and fell again, and somewhere behind me I could hear shouting, could hear them coming, and all I could think was that I'd wasted my 20s teaching rich people to ski and I was going to die in these mountains and nobody would ever know it wasn't an accident. A helicopter passed overhead, search and rescue, someone must have reported the explosion, and I screamed and waved my arms, but the sound that came out was wrong, muffled and distant through the damage in my ears. They saw me anyway. Circled back, descended, and Robert and whoever his partner was melted into the wilderness like ghosts. They found Robert 3 days later, dead from exposure in a snow cave near Lost Ridge. Hypothermia, the report said, but I knew better. Knew he'd chosen that rather than capture, rather than face what he'd done. They never found his partner. Never found definitive evidence linking Robert to David Pritchard's death or to the 3 other suspicious avalanches I convinced them to investigate from the past 3 years. I lost 40% of my hearing in both ears. The doctors say it might improve with time, but probably not. They say the panic attacks and spatial disorientation from the balance damage might respond to therapy, but I've been in therapy for 4 months now and I still can't stand in open spaces without feeling like the ground is about to collapse beneath me, without hearing phantom thunder that makes my heart seize up in my chest. I moved back to Portland in May. Moved in with my parents because I can't work, can't function, can't exist in the world the way I used to. My sister visits sometimes with her dentist husband, and they're kind about it, but I can see the pity in their eyes, can see them mentally calculating how close they came to this version of broken. The worst part isn't the physical damage or even the psychological trauma. The worst part is knowing that Robert was right about one thing: the snow does erase everything. Somewhere in those mountains are more victims, more people who died alone while someone watched and calculated and set off explosions that made their murders look like nature's random cruelty. And sometimes, late at night when my ears are ringing and my balance is shot and I can't tell what's real sound and what's phantom echo, I think about how I'd spent 5 years in Alaska feeling invisible and insignificant, feeling like my life didn't matter enough to be noticed. I'd wanted to matter. I'd wanted to be seen. Robert had seen me. Had noticed me noticing him. And in that moment of recognition, in that horrible meeting of eyes across the snow, I'd finally understood what it meant to be truly alone, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of realizing that the only person who really saw you for 3 years was someone who'd been deciding whether you were worth killing. The avalanche sounds still visit me in dreams, those impossible booms that shake the earth and herald nothing, and I wake up in my childhood bedroom in Portland with my ears screaming and my heart racing and the certainty that somewhere out there, Robert's partner is still working. Still planting charges. Still creating thunder in the mountains. Still hunting. And there's nothing I can do about it except live with this knowledge, this horrible certainty that some murders are so perfectly disguised as accidents that nobody will ever believe they're anything else. The mountains keep their secrets. The snow erases everything. And I keep listening for sounds that aren't there, for thunder that heralds nothing except the memory of the day I learned that being truly seen is sometimes the most terrifying thing that can happen to you. At 29 years old, I'd become an expert at conversations I never finished. Not with other people, those were rare enough in my line of work, but with myself, endless internal monologues that looped and spiraled and went nowhere, the mental equivalent of driving in circles around Valdez at 3 in the morning because sleep wouldn't come and the silence in my apartment was somehow louder than the wind off Prince William's sound. I talked to myself constantly. In the truck during the long drives to remote tower sites. While installing relay equipment on mountain ridges where the only other sounds were wind and the occasional distant rumble of calving glaciers. While eating microwave dinners in front of my laptop, watching shows I'd already seen twice because my internet was too slow for streaming anything new. It was a habit born from isolation, from being the only communications technician covering a territory that stretched from Cordova to Glen Ellen, from spending weeks at a time with no human contact except brief check-ins with dispatch. My ex-girlfriend Amanda used to say I was more comfortable talking to machines than people. She'd meant it as an insult during one of our final arguments before she moved back to Seattle, but she wasn't wrong. Machines were predictable. They had problems with clear solutions. They didn't require the kind of emotional labor that relationships demanded, didn't ask why I'd chosen to work in one of the most isolated regions of Alaska when I could have taken a job anywhere else with my skill set. The truth I'd never told her was that I hadn't chosen Alaska despite the isolation. I'd chosen it because of it. May in the Chugach Mountains near Valdez is a study in contradictions, snow still clinging to the peaks while wildflowers push through the lower meadows, temperatures swinging 40 degrees between dawn and afternoon, glacial rivers running fast and cold with meltwater that could kill you in minutes. I'd been contracted to install new relay equipment on a series of ridges that would improve cell coverage for the Richardson Highway corridor, work that required hiking into terrain accessible only by helicopter or a grueling 8-mile approach through unstable terrain. I chose to hike. Cheaper for the company, and I preferred the solitude of the approach to making small talk with a pilot. The first echo happened on the third day, around 2 in the afternoon. I was working on a relay box bolted to an outcropping at about 4,000 feet, my hands greasy with dielectric compound, muttering my usual stream of consciousness complaints about the design flaws in the mounting bracket. Fucking engineers in their Seattle offices, I said to nobody, never actually install this shit themselves. Never actually install this shit themselves, came back to me, clear as a bell, but wrong. The delay was too short, maybe half a second, and it came from the wrong direction entirely, from a cliff face to my left where the rock formation was all wrong for producing echoes. Smooth granite, no concave surfaces, nothing that would reflect sound waves back with that kind of clarity. I stopped working. Looked around. Saw nothing but empty wilderness, rock and snow and the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like physical pressure. Hello? I called out. Silence. No echo at all this time, which made the first one even stranger. I went back to work, but the unease lingered, a prickling sensation at the base of my skull that I recognized as my body's threat detection system activating without conscious input. I worked faster, wanting to finish and get back to camp, and I didn't talk to myself for the rest of the afternoon, which felt like holding my breath underwater. The second incident was worse. It happened 2 days later, at a different site about 3 miles northeast. I was testing signal strength, recording measurements in my notebook, and I'd been thinking out loud about my approach, standard practice for solo technical work, a way to catch your own mistakes before they become problems. Signal degradation at 2.3 kilometers, I muttered, probably atmospheric interference, need to adjust the gain. Need to adjust the gain, the echo came back, but this time it was different. Wrong. Because I hadn't said those words out loud yet. I'd been thinking them, forming them in my mind, and the echo spoke them a full second before I'd opened my mouth. My blood turned to ice water. I spun around, dropping my equipment, my hands shaking as I scanned the ridgeline. Nothing. Nobody. Just me and the wind and the impossible echo of words I hadn't spoken. That's when I started to seriously consider that I was losing my mind. Psychotic break, maybe, brought on by isolation and the kind of loneliness that had become so fundamental to my existence that I'd stopped noticing it, like background radiation you only detect when it reaches critical levels. I'd read about it, isolation psychosis, usually affecting people in polar research stations or submarine crews, hallucinations and paranoia that felt absolutely real to the person experiencing them. I called dispatch that night from my camp, spoke to Melissa who handled scheduling, tried to keep my voice casual and professional. "Hey, just checking in. Everything going okay on your end?" "Fine, Nathan. You sound weird. You feeling alright?" "Yeah, just, long time alone. Sometimes it gets to you." There was a pause, and I could hear her thinking through the static. Melissa was 50-something, had worked dispatch for 15 years, had probably heard every flavor of breakdown from field techs working solo contracts. "You need to come in early? I can send someone else to finish." The offer was tempting. But I thought about my apartment in Valdez, about going back to those four walls and that same internal monologue and the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with my brain. At least out here, the wrongness had a context. At least out here, I could pretend it was just the isolation. "No," I said. "I'm good. 2 more sites and I'm done." The third time it happened, I wasn't alone. I'd stopped at a supply cache near Thompson Pass to restock my fuel and rations, and there were 2 hikers there, a couple in their 40s from Anchorage doing a week-long traverse. We made small talk, weather, trail conditions, the usual surface-level exchanges that pass for conversation in the backcountry. Then I mentioned the weird echoes, trying to make it sound casual, like a curiosity rather than a confession of possible insanity. "Oh yeah," the woman said, "we heard something similar yesterday. Thought it was weird, but figured it was just the acoustics up here." Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. Not psychosis. Not my brain deteriorating. Something real, something environmental, something that had a rational explanation. Except I knew better. I knew the geology, knew the physics of sound propagation, knew that what I heard was impossible through natural means. But I clung to their validation anyway, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I finished the 4th site on May 19th, and that's when I found the first recorder. It was hidden in a crevice about 30 feet from where I'd been working, a small digital device no bigger than a deck of cards, camouflaged with stone-colored tape. Solar panel for power. High-end microphone. And a wireless transmitter that could relay audio in real time. My hands were shaking as I examined it, my mind racing through implications like a computer processing data. Someone had planted this. Someone had been listening to me, recording me, for days or maybe weeks. Someone knew exactly where I'd be working because my schedule was logged with the company, accessible to anyone with basic hacking skills or social engineering. That's when I heard my own voice, crystal clear, coming from somewhere upslope. Someone had planted this. I ran. Pure animal panic, abandoning my gear, scrambling up the rocky slope toward where the voice had originated. Found another recorder. This one had a speaker attached, capable of playing back recordings. And next to it, fresh boot prints and a patch of wet snow. Someone had been here, recently, maybe minutes ago. "Hello, Nathan?" My own voice, slightly distorted, coming from a different direction now. You're probably wondering what this is all about. I spun toward the sound, our hammering, pulling my satellite phone from my pocket with shaking hands. No signal. I was in a dead zone, which wasn't an accident, I realized. Whoever this was knew the coverage map as well as I did, knew exactly where I'd be vulnerable and isolated and completely alone. I've been studying you for 6 weeks, my voice continued, but the cadence was off, words spliced together from different recordings. Learning your patterns. Your speech rhythms. The way you think out loud. Did you know you say fucking engineers at least 3 times a day? The horror of it sank in like frostbite, that creeping realization that someone had been watching me, listening to me, documenting my most private moments. All those conversations with myself, all those thoughts I had spoken into the void thinking I was alone, someone had been cataloging them, studying them, learning me in a way that was more intimate and violating than anything physical. Who are you? I screamed into the wilderness. What do you want? You're asking the wrong questions, my voice replied, and this time I saw the speaker, hidden in a rockfall about 50 yards upslope. You should be asking, what do the others ask? Others. There were others. This wasn't about me specifically. I was just the latest in a series, a pattern, someone who hunted isolated workers in remote locations and studied them and then, what? Killed them? Made them disappear in a place where disappearances were explained away by bears or weather or simple bad luck. I saw him then, just a silhouette against the sky, standing on the ridge above me. Couldn't make out features, just a human shape, watching. He raised something, a phone maybe, or another recorder, and I heard my own voice one more time. I should have called in early. The past tense chilled me more than the sub-zero temperatures I'd endured. He was speaking of me like I was already dead. I ran downslope, abandoning stealth for speed, my boots slipping on loose scree, my lungs burning with the thin mountain air. Behind me I could hear him following, could hear the crunch of his footsteps, and scattered across the mountainside I could hear my own voice speaking from hidden speakers, fragments of my life played back at me like a demented echo chamber. Sometimes it gets to you. I'm good. Fucking engineers. I chose to hike. Every word I'd spoken in 6 weeks, cataloged and weaponized, turned into proof that he'd owned me completely without me ever knowing. The glacial river appeared ahead of me, running fast and violent with snowmelt, the kind of water that would stop your heart in seconds. I didn't hesitate. Jumped. The cold was beyond cold, beyond anything I'd experienced, a total system shock that blanked out thought and left only the animal imperative to survive. The current took me, smashed me against rocks, dragged me under and spit me out, and I grabbed at anything I could reach, finally catching a deadfall tree that had fallen across the river downstream. Pulled myself out with arms that barely functioned, my left hand already going numb in a way that felt permanent. I don't remember much about the next 12 hours. Hypothermia does strange things to memory, to cognition, to your sense of self. I remember walking, falling, walking again. Remember finally reaching the highway and flagging down a trucker who took one look at me and called emergency services. They amputated 2 fingers from my left hand, the pinky and ring finger, blackened with frostbite that had killed the tissue beyond any hope of recovery. The surgeon told me I was lucky. That if I'd been in the water another minute I'd be dead. That people don't survive what I'd survived. But survival is relative. The physical damage healed, more or less. The psychological damage is permanent. Because they never found him. Never found evidence of the recorders beyond the 2 I discovered. Never found the bodies of the others he mentioned, if they even existed. The police were sympathetic but skeptical, suggested that the head trauma from my ordeal might have caused confusion, false memories, paranoid delusions. And that's what haunts me now, 9 months later, living in a group home in Anchorage because I can't work anymore, can't be alone anymore, can't trust my own perceptions of reality. Because maybe they're right. Maybe it was all hallucination, isolation psychosis, my mind fragmenting under the weight of loneliness I'd chosen but couldn't sustain. Or maybe it was real. Maybe someone is still out there, still planting recorders, still studying victims, still speaking to them in their own voices until they can't tell what's real and what's echo. I catch myself talking out loud sometimes, old habits dying hard, and I stop mid-sentence with my heart racing, listening for the echo that might come back wrong. The other residents think I'm paranoid. The counselors adjust my medications. And maybe they're right too, because the alternative is worse. The alternative is that someone out there knows me better than I know myself. Has recordings of my every thought, my every fear, 6 weeks of my life distilled into data that he can replay and study and use to understand exactly how I think. And if he knows me that well, if he's mapped my psychology with that level of precision, then he knows I'll never be sure. He knows that this uncertainty, this inability to trust my own perception, is worse than any physical injury. He knows that he's already won, whether he comes for me again or not. Because every time I hear my own voice, every time I catch my reflection and wonder if I'm really alone, every time the counselors suggest that maybe it was all in my head, part of me wonders if they're right. And part of me hears my own voice, crystal clear and impossible, saying, "That's exactly what I wanted you to think." I've always thought the worst thing about Alaska wasn't the cold or the darkness or even the crushing isolation that makes you feel like the last person on a dying planet. It was the way it made you disappear. Not physically, though that happened too, more often than people wanted to admit. No, it was the way it erased you slowly, like frostbite eating away at exposed flesh, until you looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the hollow-eyed stranger staring back. I was 19 years old and already disappearing when I made the drive from Fairbanks back to Anchorage that February afternoon. The thermometer had read -34 when I left campus, and the weather reports warned of a blizzard moving in from the northwest, but I went anyway because I couldn't stand another night in that cramped dorm room, couldn't stand the sound of my roommates breathing, couldn't stand the weight of being so utterly, devastatingly alone in a place where loneliness was supposed to be impossible because everyone was crushed together for warmth and survival. My mother had moved us to Alaska when I was 16, chasing some fantasy about frontier living and authentic experiences after my father left her for his dental hygienist in Phoenix. She bought into the myth that running to the edge of the world could outrun pain. 3 years later, she was working double shifts at a cannery in Seward, and I was studying environmental science at UAF, and we were both learning that geography doesn't heal anything. It just gives your wounds a different backdrop. The snow started falling around mile marker 47 on the park's highway. Not the gentle, picturesque snow from Christmas cards, but the kind of snow that falls with malicious intent, thick and heavy and blinding. The kind that swallows landmarks and road lines and eventually swallows you too if you're stupid enough to keep driving. I should have pulled over. I should have turned back. I should have done 1,000 things differently, but I was 19 and convinced that my misery was somehow special, that the universe owed me safe passage through my self-imposed suffering. I didn't see the patch of black ice until my Honda was spinning, a sickening pirouette of screeching metal and my own screaming, and then I was airborne for what felt like hours but must have been seconds, and then the world went white and silent and wrong. The car settled at the bottom of a ravine with a final groan of twisted metal. My head had cracked against the driver's side window hard enough to spiderweb the glass, and when I touched my temple, my fingers came away red and sticky. The engine was dead. The heater was dead. My phone showed no signal, which was as predictable as it was terrifying. The temperature inside the car was already dropping, that particular kind of cold that doesn't just chill your body but seems to freeze the air itself, making each breath feel like swallowing shards of glass. I tried the doors. The driver's side was crushed against frozen earth, and the passenger's side opened onto a wall of snow. I was trapped in a metal coffin that was rapidly becoming a metal freezer, and night was coming with the inevitability of a closing fist. That's why I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were hallucinations, my oxygen-starved brain conjuring rescue from desperate hope. But they kept coming, wavering through the white curtain of snow, and then I heard the crunch of boots on ice, steady and purposeful, and then a face appeared at my window, backlit by a flashlight that made him look like some kind of angel. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "Are you hurt?" His name was Michael, or so he said, and he looked like every other middle-aged white man in Alaska, weather-beaten face, thick beard frosted with ice, eyes that had seen enough winters to know exactly how quickly someone could die in this kind of cold. He helped me climb out through the passenger window, and the wind hit me like a physical assault, stealing my breath and my equilibrium. I would have fallen if he hadn't caught my arm. "My cabin's not far," he shouted over the howling wind. "Can you walk?" I nodded, because what else could I do? Stay here and freeze? The snow was already working its way into my boots, and I could feel my toes starting to go numb. He wrapped something around me, a blanket that smelled like diesel and would smoke, and started walking, and I followed, because humans are hardwired to trust authority in crisis situations, even when that authority is a stranger leading you deeper into the wilderness during a whiteout blizzard. Not far turned out to be a lie, or maybe his concept of distance had been warped by years of living in a place where close meant anything under 10 miles. We walked for what felt like hours, but my phone was dead, so I couldn't be sure. My thoughts started to fracture from the cold, skipping like a scratched record. I thought about my environmental science midterm that I'd now miss. I thought about whether my mother would even notice I was gone. I thought about a boy named Tyler who'd stopped texting me back after Thanksgiving break, and how pathetic it was that I'd driven through a blizzard partially because I couldn't stand the possibility of seeing him on campus with someone new. The cabin appeared through the snow like something from a nightmare, a dark shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Relief flooded through me anyway, because it meant walls and warmth and not dying alone in the frozen dark. Michael opened the door, and I stumbled inside, my legs barely functioning. It took me a few minutes to register that something was wrong. Maybe it was the shock, or the cold, or the head injury, but my brain was slow to process the details. The cabin was too clean. Not lived-in clean, but staged clean, like a movie set. There was a table with 2 chairs, perfectly positioned. A wood stove that radiated heat. A bed with white sheets that looked too fresh, too pristine. And there were locks on the inside of the door. Multiple locks. Heavy-duty deadbolts that made no sense for a cabin in the middle of nowhere where the only thing you needed to keep out was the cold. "Sit," Michael said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll make coffee." I sat because my legs gave out, and I watched him move around the cabin with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was, and that's when I saw the chains. They were partially hidden under the bed, coiled like sleeping snakes, but the metal caught the firelight and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. There were hooks in the wall above the bed. There were dark stains on the floorboards that could have been old spills or could have been something so much worse. And on the small table next to the stove, arranged like medical instruments, were zip ties and duct tape and a hunting knife with a handle worn smooth from use. My therapist would later tell me that the human brain has 3 responses to perceived danger: fight, flight, or freeze. She'd explain that freezing is actually the most common, an evolutionary holdover from when playing dead could save you from a predator. But in that moment, as I stared at those chains and felt Michael's eyes on the back of my neck, I understood that freezing doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like drowning in air, like every muscle in your body has been replaced with cement. "You're lucky I came along," Michael said, and his voice had changed. The concerned Good Samaritan edge was gone, replaced by something flat and mechanical. Most people would have left you out there. Most people don't care. I tried to stand, but he was already moving, crossing the small space with terrifying speed for a man his size. His hand clamped around my wrist, and I felt the tendons grind together, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A satisfied smile, like a hunter who's finally cornered wounded prey after a long chase. "The cold will kill any sound you make," he said, almost conversationally. "I've tested it. Even screaming at the top of your lungs, nobody hears anything past about 30 feet in this weather. And we're 12 miles from the nearest occupied cabin. 12 miles. 3 hours of walking through that hell. I'd been such an idiot, so eager to escape my small miseries that I'd walked straight into something infinitely worse. My mind was racing now, shock giving way to pure animal panic. I saw my future in those chains, in the dark stains on the floor, in the way he was looking at me like I was a problem he was already solving. I don't remember the exact moment I decided to fight back. Maybe there wasn't a decision at all, just instinct taking over when conscious thought became useless. I drove my knee up between his legs with every ounce of strength I had left, and when he doubled over with a grunt of pain, I grabbed the coffee pot he'd just filled and smashed it across his face. Boiling water and broken glass and his screaming, and I was running for the door. The locks. Jesus Christ, the locks. My fingers were numb and shaking, and there were too many of them, deadbolts and chains and a padlock, and he was getting up behind me. I could hear him moving, and I was sobbing and screaming, and finally, the last lock gave way. The cold hit me like a wall of knives, but I ran anyway, barefoot because I'd taken off my boots when we'd first arrived, ran into the white howling nothing with blood from my head wound freezing in my hair and my lungs burning from the frigid air. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the snow, and I knew I wouldn't make it far, knew that between the cold and the head injury and the complete disorientation, I had maybe minutes before I collapsed. That's when I heard the howling. It started low and distant, then grew closer, that haunting sound that makes every primitive part of your brain light up with warning. Wolf. Gray wolf, probably, judging by the pitch. And then I saw it, a dark shape moving through the snow about 20 yards to my left, and some insane part of my brain registered that it was huge, easily over 100 pounds, and that wolves in Alaska had been known to attack humans when desperate or territorial. Michael saw it too. I heard him stop running, heard his sharp intake of breath, and then the crack of a gunshot impossibly loud in the muffled white silence. He was shooting at the wolf, or trying to, but the animal had vanished into the storm like smoke. Another shot. Another. And I kept running, using his distraction to put distance between us, running until my feet were numb blocks of ice and my lungs felt like they were collapsing. I don't remember much about the rest of that night. The search and rescue team told me later that they found me 17 miles from Michael's cabin, curled in a hollow log, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. They'd been searching for me since I missed my check-in call with my mother, and they found Michael too, arrested him at his cabin where they discovered evidence of at least 4 other victims who hadn't been as lucky as me. 4 other girls. 4 other people who'd made the same stupid mistake of trusting a helpful stranger, of thinking that human kindness was more likely than human cruelty in the vast Alaskan wilderness. I lost 4 toes on my left foot to frostbite. The surgeons saved the rest, but I can still feel them sometimes, phantom sensations of toes that aren't there anymore, burning with cold that never goes away. I can't drive in snow. I can't be alone in small spaces. I can't hear wind without my heart rate spiking into dangerous territory. I dropped out of UAF and moved back to Phoenix, back to heat and crowds and the artificial safety of a city where you're never truly alone. But here's the thing that haunts me more than the scars or the nightmares or the panic attacks that come without warning. I think about those 3 hours I walked with him through the storm, and how the most terrifying part wasn't the cabin or the chains or even the moment I realized what he was. The most terrifying part was how close I'd come to not fighting back at all, how the same crushing isolation and loneliness that had sent me driving into that storm had almost made me complicit in my own destruction. Sometimes I still dream about that gray wolf, appearing through the snow like something from a fairy tale. The rangers told me I was probably hallucinating from the head injury and hypothermia, that there were no wolf tracks near where they found me. But I know what I saw. I know what saved me. And I know that in Alaska, in that vast white nowhere where humans convince themselves they're the apex predators, sometimes the real monsters walk upright and offer help with a smile, while the things we're taught to fear are the ones that remind us to run. The doctors say my anxiety and PTSD will improve with time and therapy. They don't understand that the worst part isn't the fear. It's the knowledge. The certainty that I walked into that trap because some broken part of me didn't really care if I made it home at all. And now I have to live with that, with the phantom burning in toes that no longer exist, with the memory of how close I came to disappearing completely in the white silence of the last frontier. Michael is serving consecutive life sentences in Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward. Sometimes I imagine him in his cell, and I wonder if he thinks about me, about the one who got away. I wonder if he dreams about the cold. I know I do. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being 25 and realizing you've already peaked, that the best version of your life happened somewhere in the rearview mirror and you missed it because you were too busy assuming there'd be something better ahead. I thought about that a lot during my drives across Alaska, fixing communication towers that connected people I'd never meet, maintaining the infrastructure of human connection while sitting alone in a truck that smelled like stale coffee and defeat. October in the interior is when the land starts dying. Not the peaceful death of autumn in the lower 48, all golden leaves and pumpkin spice bullshit, but something harsher, more honest. The trees turn skeletal. The ground freezes into iron. The light bleeds away earlier each day, like the world is slowly closing its eyes and deciding not to wake up. I'd been based out of Fairbanks for 3 years, and I still wasn't used to it, that creeping sense that nature itself was giving up. The work order came through on a Tuesday, Tower AK-447, about 60 miles northwest of Nenana, deep in the taiga where the spruce trees grow so thick and close they look like prison bars. Communication failure, probably ice damage or a downed line. Standard repair, 2-day job maximum, maybe 3 if the weather turned. I loaded my truck with the usual gear, tools, emergency rations, cold weather equipment, satellite phone because cell service out there was a sick joke, and I tried not to think about how this was my life now. A bachelor's degree in telecommunications engineering from UAA, and I was essentially a glorified handyman driving into the wilderness alone because I was cheaper than sending a crew. My ex-girlfriend, Rebecca, used to say I had a talent for isolating myself. She'd meant it as criticism during one of our final fights, screaming at me in our Anchorage apartment about how I chose remote assignments on purpose, how I used the job as an excuse to avoid building anything real. She'd moved to Seattle 6 months ago with a software developer named Connor who probably had normal working hours and a 401k and didn't smell like diesel fuel and frozen earth. I'd stopped checking her Instagram after I saw their hiking photos in the Cascades, both of them grinning with the kind of happiness that seemed as foreign to me as tropical beaches. The truth she'd been right about but wrong about why, I did choose the isolation. Not to avoid connection, but because I tried connection and failed so completely that solitude felt like mercy. Out here, nobody expected anything from me except functional equipment and timely reports. No disappointed parents asking why I moved back to Spokane. No friends from college wondering why I disappeared. No Rebecca looking at me with that particular expression that meant she'd realized I was never going to be enough. I reached the access road around 2 in the afternoon. Calling it a road was generous, more like a suggestion of a path, 2 tire ruts cutting through wilderness that hadn't changed since the Ice Age. The trees pressed in close, black spruce and tamarack creating a tunnel of shadows even in full daylight. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees, and the weather report warned of an early season storm moving in from the northwest. I had maybe 36 hours before conditions got genuinely dangerous. The tower stood in a clearing that looked carved from the forest by something violent and sudden. It rose 200 feet, a skeletal finger pointing at an indifferent sky, red aviation lights blinking in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. The equipment shed at the base was standard issue, maybe 10 by 12 feet, filled with backup generators and circuit panels and the humming white noise of technology. I'd been in 100 just like it. I set up camp in my truck, which was safer and warmer than a tent. Made myself instant ramen on my camping stove. Checked in with dispatch via satellite phone, on site, starting diagnostics tomorrow morning. The sun set around 6, and the darkness that followed wasn't like city darkness or even suburbs darkness. This was primordial darkness, absolute and consuming, the kind that makes you understand why ancient humans feared the night. That's when I heard the first scream. It cut through the silence like a blade, a sound so purely agonized that my entire body locked up in primal response. Human. It sounded human. A woman, maybe, or a child, the kind of shriek that came from pain so extreme it bypassed all psychological filters and went straight to vocal cords. It lasted 5, maybe 6 seconds, then cut off with abruptness that was somehow worse than the screaming itself. I sat frozen in my truck, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The rational part of my brain, the part with the engineering degree and 3 years of wilderness experience, cataloged possibilities. Fox. They sounded disturbingly human when they screamed, especially during mating season. Or lynx, which could make sounds like a woman being murdered. Or even a rabbit being killed by a predator, which produced shrieks that evolution had designed to sound like human suffering because it triggered the same emergency response. The scream came again, from a different direction this time, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. It was further away but somehow more horrible, a rising wail that seemed to contain actual words, syllables of pure agony stretched into something almost linguistic. My mind tried to convince me it was wind through the trees, ice cracking, my imagination working overtime in the isolation. But I knew. Some animal part of my brain that predated language and logic knew that what I was hearing wasn't natural. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, that scream that sounded like the last sound someone would ever make. I checked and rechecked my doors were locked, which was absurd because I was miles from another human being, because whatever was making those sounds was just wildlife, just normal Alaskan wilderness sounds that my city-softened brain was misinterpreting. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to reveal what the darkness had been hiding. I made coffee with shaking hands and told myself I was being ridiculous, that isolation and stress were making me paranoid. I'd do the tower repair and get the hell out of here by tomorrow afternoon. The equipment damage was worse than expected. Ice had formed inside one of the relay boxes, and I had to replace the entire unit, which meant climbing the tower to the 100-foot platform in winds that threatened to tear me off the metal rungs. By the time I finished, it was almost 4 o'clock, and my muscles ached with that deep fatigue that comes from sustained fear and physical exertion. The second night was when things got worse. The screams started earlier, around 7, just after full dark. But this time they were closer, maybe a quarter-mile away, and they followed a pattern. 3 screams, each lasting about 10 seconds, then silence for exactly 5 minutes, then 3 more screams. The precision of it was what terrified me most. Animals don't scream on a schedule. Animals don't space their vocalizations with mathematical accuracy. I sat in my truck with every light on, burning through my battery, and I thought about Rebecca and how she'd said I was running from intimacy. But what I was running from, what I'd always been running from, was this feeling right here, the certainty that I was fundamentally alone in a universe that didn't care whether I lived or died. The towers I fixed connected millions of people, but I couldn't connect anyone, couldn't bridge the gap between my internal landscape and another human being's reality. And now I was actually alone, actually isolated, and something out there in the dark was screaming with my voice. Because that's what I'd realized on the 3rd repetition of the pattern, the screams sounded like me. Not exactly, but close enough that when I heard them, I imagined it was my own voice, imagined myself out there in the black spruce forest, dying slowly while I sat safe and warm in my truck and did nothing. On the fourth day, I saw him. I'd spent the morning installing the new relay equipment, trying to ignore my fraying nerves and the fact that I hadn't slept more than 20 minutes at a time. I was packing up tools when movement caught my eye at the tree line. Just a flash of something pale against the dark trunks, there and gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then I saw him again, about 40 yards away, partially concealed behind a spruce tree. A man, watching me. Just standing there, absolutely motionless, wearing what looked like a parka that had once been white but was now stained with dirt and something darker. His face was too far away to make out clearly, but I could see he was staring at me with the kind of focused intensity that predators have when they've spotted prey. "Hey!" I shouted, and my voice sounded thin and weak in the vast silence. "You need help?" He didn't respond. Didn't move. And something about his absolute stillness activated every alarm system in my nervous system. This wasn't a hiker who was lost. This wasn't a hunter or a trapper or a ranger. This was something wrong, something deeply and fundamentally wrong. I grabbed my satellite phone and backed toward my truck, not taking my eyes off the tree line. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. When I looked back, he was gone, just vanished like he'd never been there at all. That's when I heard them, the screams, but different. Closer. And coming from multiple directions. They surrounded me, these shrieks of agony, and I realized with horror that they weren't random. They were coming from specific locations, moving in a pattern, a tightening circle with me at the center. And they weren't animal sounds or wind or my imagination. They were human vocal cords producing sounds of suffering, practiced and perfected and performed with the kind of skill that only comes from repetition. He was hunting me. Using sound to hurt me, to terrify me, to study my reactions like I was a rat in a maze he built in the wilderness. I ran for the tower. The equipment shed had a door that locked from inside, but it was flimsy, wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. The tower itself, though, the tower had a locked equipment platform at the 100-foot level, reinforced metal, secure. If I could get up there, I could call for help, could wait for rescue above whatever nightmare was playing out on the ground. The screams followed me as I climbed, my boots slipping on frost-covered rungs, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs. At 50 feet, I looked down and saw him emerge from the trees. He was carrying something, a megaphone maybe, or some kind of amplifier. That's how he made the sounds come from multiple directions. That's how he practiced, perfected, learned exactly what frequency and pitch would trigger the maximum terror response. At 70 feet, I heard him start climbing below me. The tower vibrated with his weight, this steady rhythmic shaking that told me he was strong and fast and determined. I climbed faster, my hands numb from cold and fear, the wind whipping in my jacket. At 90 feet, I heard him speak for the first time. His voice was calm, conversational, rising through the darkness. "I've been doing this for 7 years. Do you know how many people have climbed this tower before you?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Reached the platform at 100 feet and scrambled through the access hatch, slammed it shut and engaged the lock just as his hand appeared at the opening. I heard him laugh, a sound worse than the screams because it was so genuinely amused. "That's okay," he said. "I can wait. The storm's coming in tonight. -20 degrees with wind chill. How long can you last up there?" That's when the snow started falling, thick and heavy, and I realized I'd locked myself in a metal cage 100 feet above the ground with no food, no water, no cold weather gear except what I was wearing. The platform was maybe 6 by 6 feet, open to the elements on all sides. Below me, I could hear him settling in at the base of the tower, and occasionally he'd scream again, my voice coming from his throat, practicing his craft. The next 48 hours dissolved into a waking nightmare of cold and dehydration and the slow understanding that I was going to die up here. The storm brought winds that made the tower sway, snow that piled up on the platform until I had to keep moving to avoid being buried. My satellite phone worked long enough to call for help, but the storm had grounded all rescue helicopters. Ground teams were coming, but it would take time, maybe too much time. I thought about Rebecca a lot during those hours. Thought about how she'd been right that I isolated myself, but wrong about why. I wasn't avoiding intimacy because I was afraid of connection. I was avoiding it because I'd already connected to the emptiness at the center of everything, had felt its pull like gravity, and I knew that if I let anyone get too close, they'd feel it too. The screaming man below me understood. He'd found the emptiness, and instead of running from it, he'd made it his art. The rescue team found me on the third day. Hypothermic, severely dehydrated, my ears damaged from the wind and cold. They found him too, in a cabin 2 miles away, found the equipment he'd used, recording devices, amplifiers, logs documenting every person who'd come to service the tower over 7 years. Found evidence of 3 who'd never made it back. They tell me my hearing will partially return with time. They tell me the nightmares will fade. They tell me I was lucky. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment in Spokane where I moved to be near my parents, where I got a job doing tech support because I can't go back to the towers, I hear screaming. My therapist says it's tinnitus, damage to my auditory nerves, my brain trying to fill the silence with phantom sounds. But I know better. I know what I learned up there in the frozen dark, locked in my cage while he screamed with my voice. I learned that the thing I'd been running from my whole life, that sense of isolation, of being fundamentally disconnected from the human experience, wasn't something broken in me. It was something true about the world. And some people, when they see that truth, don't run from it. They embrace it. They practice it. They perfect it. And they wait in the wilderness for people like me, who already half believe we don't deserve to be saved.